Hey guys, we are in the WallBuilders library and we are in the middle of Black History Month, obviously being February, and there's actually been some concern raised by people, semi-valid claims in some scenarios, of why are you guys spending so much time on Black history? Because isn't that just furthering the divide, furthering the narrative, the compartmentalization, what progressives like to do, put people in groups and say, well, you're part of this group, and by us highlighting Black heroes in Black History Month, isn't that part of playing into the narrative? And my first thought is that when there's such a strong narrative of the 1619 Project, of critical race theory, when there's so many lies being told, and this is a month where there are many Americans who are deceived and maybe are buying into that narrative of the 1619 Project or critical race theory or this Woodrow Wilson progressive ideology of removing so many of these Black heroes and then there's only victimization of Blacks in America, that's the whole story of America, etc. If that's a narrative that so many people are getting and they're looking for truth or looking for more of the stories, this is a really great opportunity to tell more of those stories for the people who don't know that. But I certainly understand why there'd be people saying, guys, don't play into this Black History Month isolation narrative that we only talk about Black people in February, etc. I get where they're coming from, but I think there's a bigger picture too.
Yeah, and that's why we've collected so many artifacts pertaining with Black history, because it's all American history, but it's been forgotten, it's been put over in many cases, right, like you mentioned with Woodrow Wilson, it was actively taken out of the history books. And so when there is kind of this absence of it, this is a good opportunity to step in and tell the constructive, true, real story of African American participation in America from the colonial days all the way up to now. There's so much of the story that we don't get, and if we don't participate in that conversation, then the other side's just simply not going to get told.
Yeah, and this is where obviously looking at America, America used to be known as a melting pot because there were so many different nationalities, different colors of skin. There was male and female contributions. There was old and young contributions. It really was a very eclectic field that made America special and unique, where this notion, even going back to immigration, the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island was everybody come and bring the best of who you are, where you came from, and contribute that to America because that makes America better. This was part of that ideology from the late 1800s, the early 1900s. This was that unfolding narrative in America, and yet today, there are literally professors, there's actually universities who say we are banning language like America being a melting pot, because America wasn't a melting pot, again, because people are buying into this racist narrative and notion of America's past, that we're only racist, which actually leads us to something like this. So Nike shoes, first of all, side note, there's issues with Nike, the fact that they're made in China, and China has a lot of issues with slavery and concentration camps and communism. So even the notion like the Olympics being done in China, that's a problem on a lot of levels because it gives credibility on some level to China, the Communist Party, what they're doing, because almost like Germany back in 1936, where they hadn't really done as much as they were going to do, but people already knew where they were going. And it was one thing for Jesse Owens, for example, as a great American, we'll come back to Jesse in a second, showing up and winning some of these races in front of Hitler. That was awesome. But it's just interesting. Obviously, China or Nike's connection to China, a lot of problems. These shoes, however, a little more interesting because of the flag on the back.
Exactly, because these are actually a part of their collection. They're significant artifacts because they were never sold. Nike was going to release these shoes a few years ago for July 4th.
Now, by never sold, like, so did we steal these? Or?
You know, to be honest, I don't even know how we got these, but I'm glad we do.
It's a secret.
Yeah, it's a secret. But, so they were going to be released, but because of the flag on the back, one of their big spokesmen, right, Colin Kaepernick, the retired football player, said, no, you can't do that because these flags are a sign of racism. Because, you know, Betsy Ross flag, that's kind of colonial, revolutionary period. There was still slavery. They are racist symbols. And Nike said, oh, you're right, Colin. I guess we have to take these shoes off the shelves. They recalled them all, almost all. And it really kind of opened this idea in this conversation nationally that, you know, maybe the American flag is a racist symbol, or if it's not explicitly racist, it sure feels racist, which is a bogus claim, one historically, but also just symbolically too.
Well, this is where you saw a lot of sporting events then say, we will no longer do the national anthem. You had the NFL, you had the NBA, we're canceling the national anthem. Or now, in our woke ideology, there's literally people saying, well, we're going to play both national anthems. We're going to play the black national anthem and then the white national anthem, which I didn't realize the national anthem was actually a white anthem. I thought it was an American anthem. We might can come to that in a minute as we get through some of this, but this is where, as there was a lot of this movement to cancel the anthem, that the flag was racist, this is part of where this narrative unfolds, which even leads to the 1619 Project, but leads to the further communication of critical race theory. It's interesting, though, backing up historically. We've actually done some articles. You've done a lot of research on this for those articles, that the idea of the American flag, even if you look in some of the more racist periods of American history, and I'm saying racist in quotations because there's definitely, in those more racist periods, there was even very strong anti-racist sentiments, anti-slavery sentiments in those periods.
Yeah.
But when there were strong racist sentiments...
Yeah, we can even go back to the Civil War, right? Where obviously up until the Civil War, you have slavery, which is legal in the South. It had been already abolished in the vast majority of the northern states. So you have like actual, real, systematic discrimination and oppression against African Americans. During the Civil War, once that starts, you have many African Americans join the Union Army and fight for the Americans and become, really show courage and heroism on the battlefield. In fact, 7 of those guys were awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest military commendation in America, specifically for protecting the flag on the battlefield, the American flag. This picture is actually one of those gentlemen. His name is Christian Fleetwood. He was fighting in Virginia, and the color bearer guy holding the flag gets shot down. He runs in, scoops it up, running through withering fire. I mean, putting his life on the line so that the flag was not captured, it did not get disgraced, and he carries it throughout the rest of the battle. He eventually becomes a very prominent black leader in Washington, D.C., helps train many, of the next generation in, arms and combat and military. He was also a choir director of his church in D.C., so a really cool guy all the way around. But he's just one of the many heroes from the Civil War who looked at the flag and said, that flag, the American flag, is the flag fighting against the Confederacy, fighting against the slaveholding states, fighting literally against slavery for the abolition of, all the people in America, and eventually carrying those ideas of freedom globally too. But you can go through and look at guys like Frederick Douglass, who talk very positively about the flag being the symbol for freedom, not only in America, but even the world.
Well, and this is where it's really cool, looking at America as a nation. One of the things that I think you communicated this very well when we were back doing work on the American story. It's now, some of the articles, we have kept the language that you originated in our conversations. This notion that if you look at nations in world history, that the norm, the standard of nations in world history is for there to be war and brokenness and injustices and depravity. Like, sinful man is the norm of humanity. And when you have a greater mass of people, there's usually a greater mass of that brokenness, sinfulness of mankind. Where it is unique historically, where you find the exceptions are where you see a nation promoting liberty, promoting freedom, promoting equality. When a nation is doing something outside of the norm, that is a unique nation. And this is where America has become a very unique nation in that sense. And as America promoted those ideas, the American flag was that symbol that we carried in promoting these ideas of equality, of freedom. And when you look throughout American history, this is where it's even fun looking at some of the black heroes of American history who had a different idea of the American flag. And one of the guys actually goes back to this. This is the 1936 Olympic torch. Now, the 1936 Olympics were the Olympics that were done in Berlin. If you remember at this point in world history, this is also when Hitler is talking about the Aryan race being the superior race, and certainly he didn't believe that dark-colored people or Jews, we can go down a list, there's a whole bunch of people he wasn't a fan of, but he thought that they just weren't as evolved. They weren't as good as the Aryan race, and so that's why it was really interesting historically when Jesse Owens shows up, and Jesse Owens wins multiple of these races, gets multiple gold medals. Actually, this is a list of different gold medalists from some of those track and field events that were there in Berlin. And right up here at the top is Jesse Owens' names. This is actual signatures of those Olympic gold medal winners from the 1936 Olympics, and Jesse Owens' name being at the top. One of the things that's really interesting about Jesse Owens is he actually talked about when he won a gold medal, and he says when he heard the Star-Spangled Banner start to play and he saw Old Glory, the American flag being raised, he said his eyes just filled with tears. It was such a special moment for him. And this is significant too, because back in the 1930s, you definitely had some racial issues in America, right? I mean, the civil rights movement had not fully reached its end. You hadn't had some of those amendments, some of that legislation that was passed. There were definitely some major issues specifically in different terrain, right? And generally it was the racist Southern Democrat-controlled South where most of this nonsense was happening. But certainly this was part of American history at that point. And even with those issues in America, Jesse Owens recognized that there was even greater levels of evil than what was happening in America around the world. And so he was so proud to represent America. And actually at the end of the Olympics, a lot of things he did in his life were interesting. I think he went on to be a boxing coach in Chicago, right?
Well, he was very involved in the community. Actually, as soon as he got back, he actually went around the country with the Republican Party and did campaigning for various Republicans across the country because that's the party he was a part of. But then he did a lot of just community involvement. There was a story that was excellent that we really enjoy. He was doing some coaching at a boxing club, and he realized when he got there that there was an American flag flying out front. And so he literally finds
Even though they had a flagpole.
Even though they had a flagpole. So he finds an American flag, climbs up the flagpole in order to make sure that the American flag is flying. There was a guy who was interviewed in a local newspaper about this, just about how he literally, Jesse Owens, put his life on the line to make sure that the American flag was flying. And Owens went on to say that everything he has and everything he hopes to have is going to be underneath that flag, because that's the flag of liberty and freedom and the one that he literally represented across the world.
And again, this is not to say that Jesse Owens didn't have negative experiences or there weren't hard times in America at that time. He just recognized what the flag represented was the promises of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain rights, and government exists to protect those rights. These notions, these promises of America that were true, even though they weren't fully realized in all of America at that time. But here's the big picture point. If you just start telling the honest story of America, the honest story of American history is very different than the modern narrative. For the 1619 Project had an article that said the reason that we fought the American Revolution here in America was to protect the institution of slavery. That's utter nonsense. But this is sometimes the only story that people are hearing. And if that's the only narrative you hear, then you don't recognize it as a lie because you don't know that there's another side of the story. You don't know what the truth is, and there's a lot of people buying into these lies. What we are trying to do as we tell the honest story of America to the best of our ability, and not that we get it right every time, but we work really hard to by making sure that we're relying on original artifacts, original documents and sources so that you're not taking our word for it. You can look and go, oh, that's what the document actually says. That's what these documents actually are. With that being said, as we're trying to tell the honest story of America, the reason that different times a year we might highlight different heroes of American history or different moments in American history is because if that's what so many people are talking about, then we want to make sure they have truthful and honest information in front of them. The ultimate goal would be is if we are going to learn the story of America, that we're not learning it of, well, the Irish Americans did this and the Scottish Americans did this and the African Americans did this. No, it should just be, here were some great American heroes who contributed incredible things along the way. We ought to be able to leave labels aside. Teddy Roosevelt had a great speech about not being a hyphenated America, where we ought to be able to come together as a common people and just recognize people for kind of meritocracy, what they're able to contribute, what they give, how they better society, better America. And that is a much better way to view history as we study history. With that being said, as much as that is the ultimate end goal and why we highlight so many different heroes along the way, until we get there, and as long as there are people on the other side at certain and special times of the year telling these unauthentic things, telling these lies about American history, we want to make sure that with original artifacts and documents, we're able to tell the other side of the story, which is actually a more truthful, honest story of American history. So please don't be frustrated. Please don't be upset, but take the lessons, take these stories, and in moments where people are talking about things that might not be true, use the truth to help lead people to the true and honest story of American history.
And actually, one more thing, now that we're talking about it and looking at kind of the wider story of what actually happened with American history, you mentioned earlier about how the 1619 Project, one of their headlining essays was that the American Revolution was fought in order to perpetuate and really concrete slavery's position in America, which is totally bogus. I went and ran and grabbed this book. This is a book called The Color Patriots of the American Revolution by William Nell, who was a black historian in the mid-1800s. And this entire book, you can actually read it online on Google Books. And I highly suggest you do so because every chapter, it goes by colony, is filled with hundreds of stories of the African American soldiers and patriots who fought in the Revolutionary Continental Army underneath George Washington for freedom against kind of the enslavement to the British that the whole American colonies were fighting against. But even as you look, we have this right here, which is a pay receipt for an African American soldier during the Revolutionary War. We actually have a handful of those. But as you look, I mean, even guys, and we've talked about it before, guys like Peter Salem, right, Prince Sisson, Richard Allen, Lemuel Haynes, people who participated in the revolutionary struggle in major ways, without whom America literally would not exist. And you can even look after the fact of the Revolutionary War, where every single northern state by 1804 passes laws for the either immediate or gradual abolition of slavery. By 1783, Massachusetts becomes the first semi-sovereign political entity in the world to abolish slavery. They beat England by 50 years. By the first census in 1790, there's not a single slave left in Massachusetts. And there are even black leaders later on who talk about how in the entire history of Massachusetts development from colonial to state to, you know, its role in the early United States, there never was a time where African Americans weren't allowed to vote, which is very interesting. So there's so much more to the story. But yeah, piggybacking off what you had mentioned with the 1619 Project, that's just one that's just so on its face historically just wrong.
Well, and what's interesting about this, I mean, we literally have thousands and thousands of documents that help tell more of the story. And as we do these videos, it's at times a challenge for us to think, okay, what documents, because we can't go through thousands of them, but what can we highlight along the way, and just even to highlight some of the complexity of this and recognizing even the uniqueness of American story with the diversity. If you look throughout the American Revolution, Washington had approximately 76 generals. 28 of those generals came from foreign nations, which means that America, the commanders of our military in the Revolution did not largely look all the same. In fact, many of them had come from various nations around the world. This is part of the melting pot of America, and why, when we look at times like this, when we can highlight certain heroes of American history, we want to highlight some of the complexity of the people that made America so unique, so special. We are a very diverse nation, and it was part of the diversity that made this nation so special.